Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about mass incarceration. The US has less than 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners, a rate 6 to 10 times larger than that of other industrialized nations and matched only by Russia. That's more incarcerated citizens than any other country in the history of the world. So why does America have so many criminals? Is it because we commit more crime? Hardly. It's due in large part to the war on drugs, conceived by the Richard Nixon administration as a way to criminalize its most vocal opponents: anti-war activists protesting the Vietnam War and black people protesting racial discrimination. Instead of addressing either group's valid concerns, it was simply easier to lock them up. Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, who spent over a year in prison for conspiracy and perjury in the Watergate scandal, explained the strategy. Look, we understood we couldn't make it illegal to be young or poor or black in the United States, but we could criminalize their common pleasure. We understood that drugs were not the health problem we were making them out to be, but it was such a perfect issue for the Nixon White House that we couldn't resist it. Since Nixon declared his war on drugs in 1971, the prison population has increased by nearly 1,000%, and nearly half of incarcerated Americans are serving sentences for drug charges. That's because the war on drugs basically gave police permission to lock up whoever they wanted to lock up, namely Black and Latino men, who are 90% of those serving time for drug crimes, even though Black people are only 15% of drug users and Latinos are only 19%. As of 2010, there were twice as many Black men in the criminal justice system as were enslaved before the Civil War, and 1 in 3 Black males can expect to go to prison during his lifetime. Yet data suggests that white people use drugs at considerably higher rates than Black people, as much as 8 to 1 in some studies, and white youths are actually more likely to engage in drug crimes, more likely to sell drugs, and 3 times as likely to visit the emergency room for drug-related reasons. Our drug laws, however, are racially biased in favor of white people and against minorities. For years, it took 500 grams of cocaine for a white person to get a 5-year prison sentence, while a Black person got the same punishment with only 5 grams of crack. This 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing laws remained in effect until 2010, when it was reduced to 18-to-1 by the Obama administration. Nevertheless, the chemical effects of crack and cocaine are identical. Prior to 1988, the maximum prison sentence for drug violations was 1 year. Now the average sentence is nearly 7 years, while in most of the world it's a matter of months. Yet in the US, there are some nonviolent drug offenders serving prison sentences longer than Nazis sentenced at the Nuremberg trials. There are now more people in prison for drugs than were incarcerated for any crime in 1980. Every month from 1986 to 2000, a new state or federal prison was created to accommodate the ballooning prison population. In 1980, the U.S. spent triple the amount on welfare as it did on prisons. By the mid-1990s, it spent triple the amount on prisons that it did on welfare. Today, with 1.9 million Americans in prison, the U.S. spends roughly $80 billion annually on the prison industrial complex. More than 31 million people have been arrested for drug offenses since the drug war began, yet it has not tempered the rate at which Americans use drugs, nor has it halted the demand. Nor has the drop in violent crime halted the number of people sent to prison. Since 1991, violent crime has fallen more than 51%. In the 1990s alone, the nation's homicide rate dropped by half, yet the prison population continued to grow. To compound the damage, many incarcerated Americans have been stripped of their right to vote. In 1974, the Supreme Court ruled in Richardson v. Ramirez that it was constitutional to deny convicted felons their vote. Over the last 40 years, the number of convicted felons losing their voting rights has grown by 500%. In 1980, 9 states had disenfranchised around 5% of Black people convicted of felonies. By 2016, the number of states had risen to 23. More than 20% of African Americans in Florida could not vote in 2016, while 25% of Black people in Kentucky were barred from the ballot. Today, more than 6 million American citizens are deprived of their right to vote, with 1 out of 13 African Americans prohibited because of a prior conviction. Yet incarcerated Americans are counted by the U.S. Census as residing in the rural areas that house the prisons, thereby giving the area's residents more congressional representation while stripping it from those serving time. America's legacy of mass incarceration is not just about systemic racism or a failure to deal with drug consumption, but a failure or unwillingness to alleviate poverty, which creates the conditions for crime in the first place. It's about punishing crime rather than preventing it, criminalizing people instead of rehabilitating them. And that might just explain why we continue to lock up more citizens than any country in the world. The push for mass incarceration has been less about money and more about power. And power in the United States has always been tied to a system of racial hierarchy that puts white people on top, sows fear of racial minorities, and promises that white safety is contingent on black subjugation and confinement. To read more, check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth, and be sure to like and subscribe. Special thanks to Alan Wincup for the illustrations, and thank you for watching.